The dead do not move beneath ashes, yet she did. The world had already burned itself into silence by the time the last embers began to fall like dying stars, drifting through the thick, suffocating air that clung to the ruins of what had once been a village. And at the center of it all lay Elena Whitmore, half buried beneath a veil of gray, her body still, her breath so faint it barely disturbed the dust resting against her lips. As if the fire had taken everything from her except the quiet refusal to disappear completely, and above her the sky stretched wide and endless, stained a deep, smoldering crimson that seemed less like sunset and more like a wound that refused to close, while far beyond the shattered remains of timber and stone, the steady rhythm of approaching hooves cut through the unnatural stillness, slow, deliberate, unhurried, until a single rider emerged from the haze, his silhouette sharp against the burning horizon, his presence as controlled and unyielding as the world around him was broken. Duke Sebastian. Blackwood did not come for survivors. He came to confirm endings, to witness what was left when fate had already spoken. And yet as his horse stilled and his gaze swept across the desolation, something shifted in the quiet. Something so small it might have been nothing at all. A tremor beneath the ash, a whisper of movement where there should have been none. His eyes narrowed, not in hope, but in calculation, because hope had long since abandoned men like him. And still he dismounted, each step measured as he crossed the brittle ground, the faint crunch beneath his boots echoing louder than it should in a place that had forgotten sound, until he stood over her, unmoving, watching, waiting, as if even now he expected the stillness to reclaim her, but it didn't, because her fingers moved again, barely, almost imperceptible, yet enough to shatter the certainty of death, and for a brief, fleeting second, something unreadable flickered behind his gaze, something that vanished just as quickly as it came, leaving only the cold decision that followed as he bent down, his gloved hand brushing away the ash that clung to her skin, revealing a face untouched by the fire's cruelty yet marked by something far older than this night. And when he lifted her wrist, intending only to confirm life or its absence, his breath stilled, because there, against the pale line of her skin, lay a mark he had not seen in years, a mark that should not exist, a mark that belonged to a past buried deeper than any flame could reach. And in that moment, beneath a sky still burning itself into darkness, the Duke realized this was no accident, and she was never meant to be found. He should have left her there, because nothing good had ever come from things that refused to die when they were meant to. Yet Sebastian Blackwood did not release her wrist, his gaze fixed on the faint mark as if it might disappear if he looked away. But it remained, silent and undeniable, a ghost from a past he had spent years burying beneath duty and distance. And for a long moment, he simply stood there, the heat of the dying fire curling through the cold night air, his mind turning not toward mercy but toward consequence, because a girl like this did not survive alone, and marks like that did not belong to accidents. Then without another word he lifted her, her weight lighter than it should have been, her body yielding without resistance as if she had already surrendered to whatever fate had chosen for her. And yet her breath brushed faintly against his coat, warm enough to remind him that she was still here, still breathing, still a problem he had not intended to carry. His horse shifted beneath him as he mounted, holding her steady against the rise and fall of movement, the ruined village fading behind them as the road stretched into darkness, miles of empty land between what had been lost and whatever would come next. The ride was long, measured in silence rather than distance, the wind cooling the last traces of smoke that clung to her hair, carrying with it the faint scent of ash that no amount of distance could erase. And through it all Sebastian remained. Still, his thoughts controlled, contained, refusing to name the unease that settled deeper with every passing mile, because he knew what that mark meant, or at least what it had once meant, and nothing about it belonged in this moment. Not here, not with her. The manor appeared without warning, its stone walls rising out of the night like something older than memory, its windows dim with the low glow of candlelight that flickered against the glass, untouched by the chaos that had claimed the world beyond its gates. Servants moved quickly at his arrival, their quiet efficiency breaking only for a second when they noticed the figure in his arms, surprise flickering across their faces. Before discipline pulled it back into place, he did not explain, he did not need to. His presence alone was enough to silence questions that might have formed, and as the heavy doors closed behind them, shutting out the last breath of smoke and ruin, the air inside felt colder, sharper, as if the manor itself resisted what he had brought within its walls. He carried her through corridors lined with shadow and soft candlelight, past rooms that had long since forgotten warmth, until he reached a chamber prepared not for guests but for necessity, a place where time seemed to slow rather than pass. And only then did he set her down, carefully, deliberately, as though the act itself required more thought than he was willing to admit. For a brief moment he remained there, watching her, waiting for something, perhaps for her to wake, perhaps for the mark to fade. But neither happened. She lay as she had before, silent, distant, caught somewhere between presence and absence. And just as he turned to leave, her lips parted, a breath slipping free that was almost a word, almost a name, soft enough to be lost in the stillness, yet clear enough to reach him where nothing else had. And it was not a name he had expected to hear again. The name should not have meant anything, and yet it did, settling into the silence like something that had been waiting to be heard. And Sebastian did not turn back immediately, his hand still resting against the cold edge of the door, as if the moment might pass if he gave it time. But it did not fade. It lingered, threading through memory with a precision he could not ignore, and slowly, deliberately, he looked over his shoulder, his gaze returning to the still figure on the bed, her expression unchanged, her breathing shallow, as though she had not spoken at all, and yet he had heard it, clear enough to break through years of carefully constructed distance. He stepped closer again, each movement controlled, measured, unwilling to grant urgency to something he did not yet understand. And when he reached her side, he waited, watching for any sign that she might speak again. But only silence answered him, the kind that pressed in from every corner of the room, thick and unyielding, until even the faint flicker of candlelight seemed too loud against it. His eyes dropped once more to her wrist, to the mark that should not exist, and for the first time he allowed the thought to form fully, not as a passing suspicion but as a possibility that demanded acknowledgement, because if she carried that mark, and if she spoke that name, then her presence here was not chance. It was something far more dangerous, something that reached beyond coincidence and into intention. A quiet knock at the door broke the stillness, soft but insistent, and without looking away he gave a single command, his voice low, steady, the kind that did not invite hesitation. The door opened just enough for a servant to step inside, careful, silent, eyes lowered in practiced respect, awaiting instruction that had not yet been given. And for a moment Sebastian said nothing, as if even speaking might shift the fragile balance of the room. Then at last he gestured toward the bed, his tone unchanged as he ordered that she be tended, that warmth be restored, that whatever was needed be done without question. The servant bowed and moved quickly, efficient and precise. Yet even in that controlled motion there was a flicker of uncertainty, a glance that lingered half a second too long before discipline forced it away. Because everyone in this house understood that nothing entered these walls without reason, and whatever reason this girl carried, it had not yet been revealed. Sebastian stepped back, allowing space yet never fully leaving, his presence anchored to the room in a way that suggested departure was not an option, not tonight, not after what he had heard. As the hours passed, the quiet shifted, the air warming slowly, the rigid stillness of her form easing by degrees that were almost too subtle to notice, until at last her breathing deepened, uneven at first, then steadier, as if something within her had decided to return fully. And with that return came a slight movement, a turn of her head, the faintest crease between her brows as consciousness began to rise from wherever it had been hiding. Sebastian watched it happen, not with anticipation but with the same controlled focus he gave everything, because whatever she was, whatever she carried, it would reveal itself soon enough. And when her eyes finally opened, it was not confusion that met the world first, but recognition, quiet and immediate, as though she had been expecting to find him there all along. For a moment neither of them spoke, and in that silence something unspoken passed between them, something that did not belong to strangers. Elena Whitmore lay still against the pale linen, her eyes fixed on him with a clarity that did not match the weakness of her body, as if whatever had nearly taken her had failed to reach the part of her that truly mattered. Sebastian Blackwood did not move closer, did not soften. His presence remained as it always was, controlled, distant, yet there was a subtle shift in the way he watched her now, no longer observing a survivor, but assessing a question that had begun to take form. Her lips parted slightly, as though words hovered just beyond reach. But instead of speaking, she studied him, tracing the lines of his face as if confirming something only she could see. The candlelight flickered between them, casting shadows that moved but never fully broke the stillness. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, steady despite the strain. It was not fear that shaped it, nor confusion, but something far more unsettling: recognition. She said his name as though it had always belonged to her, as though she had known it long before this moment, and the sound of it settled into the room with a weight that could not be ignored. Sebastian did not react immediately, but the stillness around him sharpened, becoming something more deliberate, more focused, because names carried meaning, and the way she spoke his was not accidental. It was certain. He stepped forward then, slow, measured, stopping just short of the bed as his gaze held hers without hesitation. And when he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, the kind that did not allow space for misunderstanding. "You should not know who I am." The words were simple, but beneath them lay something far less simple, a quiet warning, a boundary that had been drawn long before she entered this place. Elena did not look away, did not retreat from the distance between them. Instead, she seemed to consider his words as though they were part of a larger truth she had yet to fully grasp. Her brow furrowed slightly, not in confusion but in effort, as if memory lingered just beyond reach. Something important, something she could almost see. "I remember," she said softly, though the words carried uncertainty, not in their intent but in their clarity, as if what she remembered was incomplete, fragmented. Sebastian's gaze sharpened at that, because memory meant connection, and connection meant risk, especially when tied to things that had already been buried. He studied her more closely now, searching for any sign that this was coincidence, that the mark on her wrist and the name she spoke were nothing more than chance. But nothing about her suggested chance, not the way she held his gaze, not the quiet strength beneath her stillness, not the absence of fear where it should have been. And for the first time since bringing her into his home, a thought formed that he could not dismiss. She was not simply someone who had survived. She was someone who had returned, and that realization settled into him with a weight that could not be ignored, because things that returned from the past rarely did so without purpose. The air between them shifted again, subtle but undeniable, and Elena seemed to feel it too, her fingers tightening slightly against the fabric beneath her as if grounding herself in the present, though her eyes remained fixed on him, searching, measuring, as if the answers she needed were written somewhere in the silence he refused to break. And in that moment, neither of them realized that whatever had begun in the ashes had already followed them here, waiting, unseen. For the moment, it would be forced into the light. Memory did not return like a gentle tide. It came in fragments, sharp and disjointed, slipping through Elena Whitmore's mind like pieces of something once whole and now broken beyond recognition. She closed her eyes for a moment as if trying to steady the weight of it, her fingers tightening against the sheets beneath her, not in fear but in resistance, as though she refused to let whatever lingered inside her pull her under again. Sebastian Blackwood remained where he stood, watching without interruption, his silence not passive but deliberate, allowing the moment to unfold without interference, because whatever she remembered mattered more than anything she might say. And when her eyes opened again, there was something different in them, not clarity, not yet, but direction, as if she could feel the edges of something real just beyond reach. "There was a house," she said quietly, her voice measured, each word chosen carefully, as though speaking too quickly might cause the memory to slip away. "Not here, not this place, another one, older, colder." The words were vague, incomplete, yet they carried a certainty that could not be dismissed. Sebastian's gaze did not waver, though something within him sharpened, because there were many houses in this land, but not many that matched what she described, and fewer still that connected to the past he had tried to forget. Elena's breath faltered slightly, not from weakness, but from effort, as if pulling the memory forward required more strength than her body could easily give. There was a door, she continued, her voice softer now, and it was never meant to be opened. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, and for the first time a flicker of something unguarded passed through Sebastian's expression before it was quickly buried beneath control, because he knew that door, not in detail, not in form, but in meaning. There were always doors that should remain closed, always things that were not meant to return. He stepped closer. Then, not out of concern but necessity, his presence shifting the air between them in a way that made the moment feel smaller, more contained, as if he could hold it in place long enough to understand it. "What else?" he asked, his voice low, steady, but beneath it lay a tension that had not been there before. Elena hesitated, not because she refused, but because the memory itself resisted, her brow furrowing as if something within her pushed back against being seen. "I do not know," she admitted. At last, though the words carried frustration rather than defeat. "It is there, but I cannot reach it." Silence followed, heavy but not empty, and Sebastian straightened slightly, his mind already moving beyond what she had said to what it might mean. Because if she remembered a house, and a door that should not be opened, then whatever had begun in the ashes had roots far deeper than a single night, and that meant it was not over, not even close. A faint sound beyond the chamber door broke the stillness, distant but distinct, footsteps measured and careful, as though whoever approached understood the weight of what lay within these walls. Sebastian's gaze shifted briefly toward the door, his expression unreadable once more, but the stillness in him had changed, sharpened into something far more alert, because whatever had followed Elena here was no longer waiting in silence. It was beginning to move. The sound did not belong to chance. It moved with intention, slow and measured along the corridor beyond the chamber door, and Sebastian Blackwood did not look surprised, only still, as if he had been waiting for something exactly like this to arrive. His gaze lingered on Elena Whitmore for a fraction longer before shifting toward the door, the candlelight catching the sharp line of his profile as his expression settled into something colder, more distant, the kind of control that came not from calm but from experience. Elena felt it too. Not the footsteps themselves, but the change in the air, the way the quiet tightened as though the walls of the manor were listening. Her fingers pressed more firmly into the fabric beneath her, grounding herself as the faint echo of movement drew closer, then stopped just outside, a pause that lasted one breath too long, as if whoever stood there understood the weight of crossing that threshold. Sebastian spoke before the knock could come, his voice low and precise. "Enter." The door opened slowly, revealing not uncertainty but restraint. A man stepped inside, dressed in the dark, understated formality of someone who belonged to the house, yet did not intrude upon it. His posture composed, his gaze lowered just enough to show respect, without blindness, and when he finally spoke, his words were careful, chosen. "Your Grace, there has been a report from the lower grounds." The phrasing was deliberate, but the meaning beneath it was not difficult to hear. Something had been found. Sebastian did not respond immediately, but the silence that followed was not hesitation. It was calculation, the kind that weighed consequences before allowing them to exist. Elena watched him, not with fear, but with a quiet awareness that sharpened as the moment unfolded, because she did not understand the details, but she understood the shift, the way the space between past and present had begun to close. "What kind of report?" Sebastian asked at last, his tone unchanged, though the stillness around him carried a new edge. The man hesitated, just enough to suggest that what he carried was not meant for open air. "There are signs, Your Grace," he said carefully, "traces that should not be there." The words lingered, heavy and unfinished, and for the first time since waking, Elena felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition without memory, as if whatever those traces were, they belonged to the same place her thoughts could not fully reach. Sebastian's gaze returned to her then, not soft, not questioning, but certain, as though the final piece of something had just been placed into position. He did not need more details, not yet, because he already understood enough. The ashes had not ended anything. They had revealed it. "Prepare the east wing," he said quietly, his command precise. And ensure no one enters without my permission. The man inclined his head at once, accepting the order without question. Though the weight of it was clear in the way he turned, his steps just slightly faster than before as he left the room. The door closing with a soft finality that echoed longer than it should have. Silence returned, but it was no longer the same. It carried tension now, a quiet awareness that something unseen had already crossed into their world. Elena shifted slightly, her breath unsteady for the first time, as if whatever had followed her here had begun to draw closer, and Sebastian remained where he stood, unmoving, watching her with a certainty that no longer allowed distance. Because whatever this was, it had already begun, and neither of them would be untouched by what came next. Silence did not return as peace. It returned as pressure, settling into the room like something unseen had taken its place among them. And Elena Whitmore felt it first not in her thoughts, but in her breath, the air seeming heavier, slower, as though each inhale carried more than it should. She shifted slightly against the pillows, her gaze no longer steady but searching, not for answers but for something she could not name, something that felt close enough to touch, yet remained just out of reach. Sebastian Blackwood did not move to reassure her, did not offer words that might soften what neither of them understood. Instead, he remained where he stood, his attention fixed not only on her, but on the space around her, as though he were listening to something beyond sound, something only experience could detect. The manor itself seemed to respond, the distant corridors quieter than before, the usual rhythm of the house subdued, as if every wall had begun to hold its breath. Elena's fingers curled slightly against the fabric beneath her, not in fear but in recognition, because the feeling pressing against her was not new. It belonged to the fragments she could not fully remember, the house, the door, the sense that something had been left behind unfinished. Her gaze lifted slowly to meet his, and for the first time uncertainty broke through her composure, not weakness, but the realization that whatever connected them was no longer distant. It was here. You feel it too, she said quietly. The words not a question but a confirmation. Sebastian did not answer immediately, but the absence of denial was answer enough, because men like him did not acknowledge what they could not control unless it had already crossed a threshold that could not be undone. The candle nearest the window flickered suddenly, its flame bending in a way that suggested a movement where there should have been none. Elena's breath caught, not in panic, but in awareness, her body reacting before her mind could follow. And in that moment something shifted within her, not memory, not fully, but instinct, a quiet pull that drew her attention toward the far side of the room, toward the shadowed corner where the light did not quite reach. Sebastian saw it, not what she saw, but the change in her, the way her focus sharpened, the way her stillness became something active, as though she were listening to something only she could hear. He stepped forward then, not hesitating this time, closing the distance between them with deliberate intent. "What is it?" he asked, his voice lower now, edged with something closer to urgency than before. Elena did not answer at once, her eyes fixed on that same place, her breath shallow but steady. "It is not here," she said finally, though her voice carried tension beneath its calm. "It is close." The words settled heavily between them, because close meant approaching, and approaching meant inevitable. Sebastian's gaze followed hers to the corner, though he saw nothing beyond shadow and stone. But that did not matter, because he had learned long ago that what could not be seen was often the most dangerous. He straightened slightly, his posture shifting into something more guarded, more prepared, because whatever this was, it was no longer waiting outside these walls. It had found its way in, and as the candlelight trembled once more, subtle but undeniable, Elena felt it again, stronger now, clearer, like a presence just beyond the edge of perception. And this time, she knew with certainty, it was looking for her. The moment stretched thin, fragile as glass, and then something unseen shifted, not in sound but in presence, as if the very air had drawn a breath it did not intend to release. Elena Whitmore felt it first along her skin, a subtle chill that did not belong to the room. Her gaze locked onto the shadowed corner, as if something there had just stepped closer without moving at all. Her fingers tightened instinctively, her body still weak, yet responding to something far stronger than strength. Sebastian Blackwood followed her focus without hesitation now. his instincts no longer questioning what could not be seen, only measuring how close it had come. The candlelight flickered again, sharper this time, bending toward that same corner as though pulled by an invisible force, and for a single, suspended second, the shadow there deepened, not darker, but fuller, as if it carried weight. Elena inhaled slowly, her breath catching at the edge of something she could not fully grasp. "It knows I am here," she said, her voice quiet but certain, the words settling into the room with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Sebastian did not dismiss it, did not question her, because denial had already lost its place in this moment. Instead, he stepped forward again, positioning himself between her and that unseen point, not out of protection alone but out of control, because whatever had entered his home would not move freely within it, not without answer. The silence pressed in tighter, stretching seconds into something longer, something heavier, until even the faint crackle of the candle seemed too loud. Then, without warning, the flame nearest the corner dimmed, not extinguished, but lowered, as though something had passed before it. Elena's breath faltered, her eyes widening slightly, not in fear but in recognition, because something inside her stirred in response. Not memory, not fully, but something older, something that understood this presence even if her mind did not. "It is not alone," she whispered, the words barely audible, yet carrying a weight that shifted the air again. Sebastian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his gaze narrowing as his mind moved ahead of the moment, calculating, preparing, because one presence could be contained, but more meant intention, meant design, and design meant this had been set into motion long before she was found in the ashes. The door behind them remained closed, the corridors beyond silent, yet the room no longer felt contained. It felt connected to something larger, something moving beyond its walls. Elena's hand moved slightly against the bed, as if reaching for something unseen, her body drawn forward by an instinct she could not resist, and for the first time since waking, her composure wavered, not breaking, but bending under the weight of something she could not yet name. Sebastian noticed it at once, his attention shifting back to her, grounding the moment before it could slip further. "You will not follow it," he said quietly, his voice firm, not commanding but absolute, the kind of certainty that allowed no argument. Elena stilled, her gaze flickering briefly toward him before returning to the shadow, as if caught between two forces she did not fully understand. The candlelight steadied for a moment, then flickered once more, softer now, as if whatever had moved closer had begun to withdraw, not leaving, but waiting, and in that quiet retreat, the truth settled between them without words. This was not an attack, not yet, it was a search, and it had already found what it was looking for. The presence did not vanish, it receded, like a tide pulling back just far enough to gather strength, and the room exhaled with it, though the air remained altered, thinner, as if something invisible had passed through and left its mark behind. Elena Whitmore felt the shift deep in her chest, not relief but awareness, because whatever had come close had not been turned away, it had simply chosen to wait. Her fingers slowly loosened against the sheets, though the tension in her body did not fully release, her gaze drifting from the shadowed corner at last, but not without hesitation. As if turning away meant losing sight of something important, Sebastian Blackwood remained between her and that space, his posture unchanged, yet the stillness in him had hardened into resolve, because what had just happened was not uncertainty anymore. It was confirmation, and confirmation demanded action. He stepped back only slightly, enough to regain distance. Without surrendering control of the room, his eyes moved once more across the chamber, not searching for what could not be seen, but marking every detail, every shift in light, every movement of air that did not belong. Then finally his gaze returned to her, sharper now, more deliberate. "You said it was searching," he said quietly, not as a question but as a statement that required refinement. Elena swallowed, her throat dry though she did not feel weak, only aware, as if her body had begun to respond to something deeper than physical strain. "It was not searching the room," she answered slowly, her voice steadier than before. "It was searching for me." The words settled heavily, undeniable in their clarity, and for a moment neither of them moved, because that truth changed everything. Sebastian did not ask how she knew, because instinct like that did not come from nowhere. It came from connection. And connection meant whatever followed her had purpose. He turned slightly then, his attention shifting toward the door, toward the corridors beyond, as if mapping the unseen paths something might take through his home. No one leaves the East Wing, he said firmly, his voice carrying the quiet authority of command, not raised, not urgent, but absolute. And though there was no one else in the room to hear it, the order seemed to settle into the walls themselves. Elena watched him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then something softened, not fear, not relief, but understanding, because she recognized what he was doing, not protecting her out of kindness, but containing something that could not yet be named. Her gaze dropped briefly to her wrist, to the mark that had drawn him to her in the first place, her fingers brushing over it lightly, as if expecting it to change, to react, but it remained the same, silent and unyielding. Yet beneath her touch, she felt something faint, not heat, not movement, but awareness, as if the mark itself had awakened in response to what had entered the room. She drew in a slow breath, her thoughts shifting, aligning in a way that felt both unfamiliar and inevitable. It knows this place, she said quietly, her voice carrying a certainty that had not been there before. Sebastian's gaze sharpened at once, because that possibility had already begun to take shape in his mind, and hearing it spoken aloud only solidified what he had hoped to delay. If it knows this place, he replied, his tone colder now, more focused, then it did not follow you here. It was already waiting. The implication settled between them, heavy and inescapable. And in that moment the manor itself seemed to change, not visibly, not in structure, but in presence. No longer a refuge, no longer untouched, but something older, something that held its own secrets beneath stone and shadow. Elena felt it too, the realization pressing into her chest with quiet certainty, because if it had been waiting here, then her arrival had not been chance, and whatever had begun in the ashes had been set into motion long before she ever opened her eyes. The realization did not settle quietly. It shifted the ground beneath everything, turning certainty into something far more fragile. Because if the presence had been waiting within these walls, then this manor was no longer separate from what had begun beyond it. Elena Whitmore felt the weight of that truth press deeper into her thoughts, not as fear, but as alignment, as if pieces that had once been scattered were beginning to move toward each other with quiet inevitability. Her gaze drifted again, not toward the corner this time, but across the room itself, tracing the stone, the shadows, the spaces between light, as though she were seeing it differently now, not as a place she had been brought to, but as something she had known in a way she could not yet explain. Sebastian Blackwood watched her closely, his attention sharper than before, because the shift in her was no longer subtle, it was growing, becoming something that could not be dismissed as coincidence or confusion. "What do you see?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, yet edged with a precision that demanded truth rather than comfort. Elena did not answer immediately, her breath slow as she tried to grasp what lay just beyond clarity. "It is not the room," she said at last, her voice quiet but steady. "It is beneath it." The words hung in the air, altering its weight, because beneath meant hidden, meant buried, meant something that had not been meant to be found. Sebastian's expression did not change, but the stillness in him shifted into something far more focused, because he knew this place, not only its structure, but its history, the parts that were spoken of and the parts that were not. "There are foundations older than this house," he said carefully, his tone revealing nothing more than fact, though beneath it lay the recognition of something he had never needed to confront directly. Elena's gaze lifted to meet his again, and this time there was no hesitation, only certainty. "It is there," she said, her voice carrying a quiet finality, "and it is open." The word struck deeper than anything before, because open meant active, meant present, meant whatever had been sealed or hidden was no longer contained. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with understanding, the kind that formed without needing to be spoken aloud. Sebastian turned slightly, his gaze shifting toward the door once more, but this time not as a boundary, as a path. Because if something beneath this manor had opened, then what they had sensed in this room was only the beginning. He moved with decision now, no longer waiting for the unseen to reveal itself further, but choosing to meet it before it could move again. "You will remain here," he said, his voice firm, leaving no space for argument, though it was not command alone that held it in place. It was necessity. Elena did not protest, did not attempt to rise, though her fingers tightened slightly as if part of her resisted the separation, because whatever called from below did not feel distant to her. It felt connected, as if it recognized her as much as she was beginning to recognize it. Sebastian paused only once before reaching the door, his gaze returning to her with a brief intensity that held more than caution, more than control, because whether he chose to acknowledge it or not, her presence had already altered the course of what would follow. Then he turned and stepped into the corridor beyond, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality, leaving Elena alone. With the fading candlelight and the growing certainty that whatever waited beneath this house had already begun to reach for her again. The door had barely closed before the silence began to change, not louder, not darker, but deeper, as if the absence of Sebastian Blackwood had removed something that had been holding the unseen at bay. Elena Whitmore remained still at first, her body pressed lightly against the mattress, her breath slow yet uneven, because the moment he left, the presence she had felt before did not retreat. It shifted, closer now, more deliberate, like something that had been waiting for her to be alone. Her fingers curled into the fabric beneath her, grounding herself as the candlelight flickered once, then steadied, then dimmed again in a rhythm that did not belong to air or movement, but to something watching, something aware. She turned her head slightly, her gaze drawn once more to the shadowed corner. Though this time the darkness there did not feel empty. It felt occupied, not in form, not in shape, but in intention. Her breath caught for a fraction of a second before she forced it steady. Again, because fear would not help her, not here, not now. Instead she listened, not with her ears but with something deeper, something that had begun to awaken within her since the moment she opened her eyes in the ashes, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, something answered. Not in words, not in sound, but in feeling, a pull, faint at first, then stronger, drawing her attention downward, beneath the floor, beneath the stone, towards something that called without voice. Her body responded before her mind could argue, her hand lifting slightly from the bed as if reaching toward that unseen depth, her pulse quickening, not from panic but from recognition, because whatever lay below was not unfamiliar. It was waiting. The candle nearest her flickered sharply, its flame bending low as if pressed by an invisible force, and for a brief moment the room seemed to tilt, not physically but perceptually, as if the boundaries of space had shifted just enough to reveal something beneath the surface. Elena closed her eyes, not to escape but to focus, because the pull was clearer that way, stronger, guiding her through the fragments that still lingered at the edge of her memory. There was a door. She had said it before, but now it felt different, no longer distant or abstract, but real, immediate. And with that realization came something else, not a memory, but a warning, sharp and sudden. Do not open it. The thought surfaced without her choosing it, without her understanding where it came from. Yet it carried weight, urgency, as if it had been spoken once before in a moment she could not recall. Her eyes opened quickly, her breath uneven now, because the pull had not lessened, it had grown stronger, and with it came the undeniable certainty that whatever lay beneath this house was not only aware of her, it was reaching for her, step by step, inch by inch, closing a distance that had already begun to disappear. And though she remained in the bed, unmoving in form, something within her had already begun to move toward it, drawn by a connection she could not yet break. And as the candlelight dimmed once more, softer now, almost fading, the truth settled over her with quiet certainty. She was never meant to leave the ashes behind, because whatever had followed her from them had only been waiting for her to return. The pull did not stop when she opened her eyes. It deepened, settling into her like something that had always belonged there, waiting for the moment it could rise again. Elena Whitmore felt it move through her with quiet certainty, not forcing, not demanding, but guiding, as if it already knew the path she would take before she chose it. Her breath slowed, not from calm, but from surrender to something she did not yet understand. The room around her faded slightly, not in form but in importance. The walls, the candlelight, the silence, all of it seemed distant compared to what lay beneath. Her hand shifted again, this time more deliberately, pressing lightly against the mattress as if testing the distance between herself and the unseen depth below. And for a moment, just a moment, she felt it answer, not physically, not with movement she could see, but with a presence that rose to meet her, faint yet undeniable, like a reflection reaching back toward its source. Her eyes closed once more, drawn inward, because the connection was clearer that way, stronger, and with it came another fragment, sharper than before, the outline of stone steps descending into darkness, the air colder there, heavier, filled with something that did not belong to the present. Her breath caught, not in fear but in recognition, because she had seen those steps before, not in memory she could place, but in something deeper, something that did not fade even when everything else had been lost. The door, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible, but now the word carried weight, form, meaning. It was not just a warning anymore. It was a path, and paths were meant to be followed. Her fingers tightened slightly, as if holding herself in place, because somewhere beneath the pull, beneath the growing certainty, that warning still lingered, quiet but insistent. Do not open it. The thought returned again, stronger now, pressing against the instinct that urged her forward, and for the first time the two forces collided, not violently, but with a tension that could not be ignored. Her breath quickened, her chest rising and falling unevenly as she struggled to hold on to both truths at once, to follow and to resist, to remember and to remain. The candlelight flickered sharply again, the flame bending low, almost extinguished, and in that moment the room seemed to tilt once more, the boundaries thinning just enough for something beneath to press closer. Elena's eyes flew open, her body tensing as the connection surged, stronger than before, clearer, more insistent, and with it came something new, not a memory, not a warning, but a call, soft, distant, yet unmistakable, calling her not by name, but by something deeper, something older, something that resonated with the mark on her wrist and the fragments in her mind. She drew in a sharp breath, her gaze locking onto the floor beneath her as if she could see through stone itself, as if she could trace the path downward to where that call originated. And for a moment, just one moment, she leaned forward, her body responding before her mind could stop it, drawn by the certainty that whatever waited below had been waiting for her long before she ever woke. And though she remained in place, unmoving in reality, something within her had already taken a step closer, crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. And as the candle finally steadied, its flame small but unbroken, the truth settled into the silence around her. The door beneath this house was not simply open, it was calling her to it. And each moment she remained here, she was already answering. The line had already been crossed before she realized it. Not in movement, but in decision. In the quiet surrender of something within her that no longer resisted the call. Elena Whitmore felt it settle into her with a certainty that could not be undone. The pull no longer distant or uncertain, but clear, direct, leading her downward through layers of stone and silence to something that waited with patience older than memory. Her breath slowed as if aligning with it, her body still upon the bed, yet no longer entirely anchored to it, because the connection had deepened beyond thought, beyond control, and in that stillness she understood something she had not allowed herself to see before. This was not something that had followed her from the ashes. It had been waiting for her long before the fire, long before the night that had taken everything else. Her eyes opened slowly, her gaze fixed not on the room but through it, as though the walls themselves had become transparent to whatever lay beneath. And for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath with her, the candlelight steady, the shadows unmoving, as if even the unseen had paused to witness what would come next. Then the door opened, not below, not yet, but behind her, the sound quiet yet unmistakable, breaking the fragile stillness with deliberate intent. Sebastian Blackwood stepped inside, his presence immediate, grounding, cutting through the unseen pull with a force that did not rely on understanding, but on will. His gaze found her at once, sharp, searching, because the moment he crossed the threshold he felt it too, stronger now, no longer hidden, no longer subtle. The presence that had lingered had risen, and in the space between them something unspoken passed. Recognition not only of each other but of the shift that had already begun. "You should not be alone," he said quietly. Though the words carried more weight than concern, they carried warning. Elena did not look away from him, but something in her expression had changed, not lost, not broken, but altered, as though part of her attention remained elsewhere, held by something he could not yet see. "It is calling me," she said, her voice steady, unafraid, and that steadiness struck deeper than fear ever could, because it meant acceptance. Sebastian stepped closer, his movements controlled yet immediate, closing the distance that had once been measured, not to command, not to restrain, but to anchor, because whatever this was, it would not take her without resistance, not within his walls, not under his watch. "No," he said, his voice low but firm, carrying a finality that did not ask for agreement. "It does not call, it draws, and what draws can be resisted." Elena held his gaze for a long moment, and in that silence something shifted again, not the presence, not the pull, but her understanding of it, because he was not wrong. The call was not gentle, not neutral. It was a force, a direction that expected her to follow without question. Her fingers tightened slightly, her breath deepening as she held on to that realization. And for the first time since the connection had begun, she did not lean toward it. She remained where she was, the pull still there, still strong, but no longer unchallenged. The candlelight flickered once more, sharper this time, as if reacting to her resistance. And in that moment the unseen presence stirred again, not retreating, not advancing, but shifting, adjusting to her refusal. Sebastian felt it, his gaze hardening as the air changed once more. Because whatever lay beneath this house had begun to understand that she would not come willingly, and that meant it would not wait forever. The silence returned again, heavier now, charged with something that had not been there before, and as Elena steadied her breath, holding herself against the pull that still whispered beneath her thoughts, she realized with quiet certainty that this was only the beginning, because whatever waited below had already reached for her once, and next time, it would not stop at calling.